In every neighborhood, there are unspoken rules that govern the interactions between neighbors. These rules are meant to preserve peace, respect personal space, and foster a sense of community. Yet, what happens when these rules are misused, twisted, and weaponized by those who believe they hold the power to dictate what is acceptable and what is not? The story of Ramirez's family and their disabled daughter, Sarah, is one such example of a neighborhood dispute that spirals into something far darker. For most families, a yard is a place of joy, a sanctuary where children can run, play, and simply be kids. But for Sarah, a 10-year-old girl with cerebral palsy, her yard was a rare space where she could experience the small joys of life. The few toys that dotted her yard were not just objects, they were symbols of freedom, mobility, and independence, things she didn't always have access to in other parts of her world. The toys were her connection to a childhood she could rarely experience without the constraints of her disability. She could sit on her toy truck or roll her dolls around in a tiny plastic car, and for that fleeting moment, she felt like every other child. No one could understand how much these moments meant to her more than her mother, Maria. But one fateful afternoon, this peaceful space, this haven for a little girl simply playing in her own yard, would be destroyed by someone who took it upon herself to enforce the rules of the neighborhood in a way that no one could have predicted. This story isn't just about a small, seemingly insignificant dispute over toys scattered across a lawn. It's about the lengths to which one woman, an HOA member named Karen, was willing to go to impose her own rigid and often harmful sense of control on the lives of those around her. Karen, who saw herself as the self-appointed protector of the neighborhood's sanctity, had a history of enforcing the HOA's rules with an iron fist, leaving little room for compassion or understanding. Her belief in her own authority led her to scrutinize every detail of the Ramirez family's life, from the placement of their trash bins to the toys Sarah played with in their front yard. What was once an innocent, joyous scene of a disabled girl enjoying a rare moment of peace in her own home quickly turned into an escalating battle for control with devastating consequences. The toys that Sarah played with, toys that were meant to be a simple part of a child's life, became the focus of Karen's obsessive need to enforce the rules. The rules that only she seemed to understand, the rules that had no room for empathy or humanity. As Sarah sat in her yard, unaware that the world around her was about to change, the tension that had been building between the Ramirez family and Karen was reaching its boiling point. What was once an innocent exchange about toys and yard space turned into something far more sinister. For Maria, this was more than just a disagreement. It was a violation of her child's innocence, a threat to her family's sense of security, and a betrayal by someone who was supposed to uphold the very values of community and safety. The tragic moment that followed would leave an indelible mark on the Ramirez family, the community, and anyone who would later hear their story. Who could have imagined that a mother's love for her disabled daughter, her desire to give her the freedom to play in her own yard, would lead to a violent confrontation, one that would change the course of their lives forever? The question that would linger for months to come would be, how could a woman armed with nothing but her misguided belief in authority turn a simple childhood moment into a nightmare? This is not just a story of one woman's attempt to impose her will on another family. It is a chilling reminder of how power can be abused, how the smallest of actions can snowball into unimaginable consequences, and how those who are most vulnerable can often become targets of the very systems that are supposed to protect them. This story is a sobering look at how unchecked authority can destroy not just a family's peace, but their very sense of safety, leading to a tragedy that no one saw coming. The conflict between the Ramirez family and their HOA began, as many neighborhood disputes do, with a minor complaint. It was about the toys Sarah played with in her yard. To most people, the sight of a child's toys scattered across a front lawn would be a symbol of life, of joy, of a family's happiness. But to Karen, the HOA member who had made it her mission to keep the neighborhood perfect, it was an offense, a disruption to the pristine image she had crafted in her mind of how things should be. Karen wasn't just a member of the Homeowners Association, she had become its enforcer. She knew the rules by heart and considered herself above them, using her power to impose what she believed were the neighborhood's standards on every resident. She had no tolerance for any deviation from her perfect vision. Anything that didn't align with her sense of order was viewed as a problem, and she believed it was her job to fix it. The Ramirez family had been on her radar for some time. While most of the neighbors had accepted Sarah's disability and her need for special accommodations, Karen viewed Sarah's presence in the yard as a nuisance, something that stood in stark contrast to the perfect, quiet neighborhood she envisioned. It started with the toys. At first, it was a complaint about the scattered dolls, trucks, and stuffed animals on the lawn. They weren't neatly stored, and to Karen, that was an eyesore. She saw this as a direct violation of HOA guidelines, despite the fact that those same rules didn't seem to apply to anyone else's property. Karen wasn't content with simply addressing this with the Ramirez family. She saw it as a personal mission. She began leaving increasingly angry notes on their doorstep, each one more forceful than the last, demanding they clean up their yard and remove the unsightly toys. When the notes went ignored, Karen decided that more drastic measures were needed. As Maria and Robert tried to navigate the daily challenges of caring for their disabled daughter, they were increasingly faced with Karen's relentless demands. Maria, who had always been a peaceful woman, found herself caught in a conflict she never expected. Her yard, once a sanctuary for Sarah, became a battleground for her family's right to exist as they were. With every note Karen left, Maria's frustration grew. She couldn't understand why Karen, who had no real understanding of Sarah's condition or needs, would make such a fuss over something so trivial. But Karen wasn't just concerned about the toys. She believed that Sarah's disability was an inconvenience to the neighborhood, that her presence was disruptive and unwanted. As weeks went by, the tension between the Ramirez family and Karen escalated. It became clear that Karen wasn't going to back down. She'd now started calling the police every time Sarah's toys were outside, insisting that they were blocking the sidewalk or creating a safety hazard. But nothing about the toys posed a threat. They were just toys scattered around for a child who could barely move without assistance. Yet, to Karen, this was an act of defiance, and she couldn't allow it. The more the Ramirez family resisted, the more determined Karen became. Her actions were no longer just about maintaining the aesthetic of the neighborhood. They had become personal. To her, this was about establishing dominance, about showing that she was the one in control. Despite her growing resentment, Maria tried to remain calm. She knew that the situation was getting out of hand, but she didn't want to escalate things further. She attempted to compromise with Karen, offering to keep the toys more neatly arranged, hoping to appease her. But Karen wasn't interested in compromise. She saw this as weakness, as an opportunity to further cement her power over the family. It was at this point that the true nature of Karen's obsession with the Ramirez family began to show. She started lurking near their house, watching from her window to ensure the toys were put away in a manner she deemed acceptable. Each time Sarah was outside, Karen would appear at the edge of the yard, staring them down. The feeling of constant surveillance took a toll on Maria and Robert. They started feeling like they couldn't even let Sarah play without the fear of Karen showing up to complain. It was no longer just about the toys. Karen had made it clear that she wanted Sarah out of her sight altogether. The final straw came one afternoon when Sarah was playing with her toy truck on the lawn, giggling as she maneuvered it across the grass. Her mother watched from the window, her heart swelling with joy as she saw her daughter enjoying a rare moment of happiness. But that moment wouldn't last long. Karen appeared, as she always did, standing at the edge of the yard with a look of disdain. She stood there for a few moments before marching up to the front door, knocking firmly. Maria opened the door, ready for the same old complaints, but this time, Karen's expression was different, colder, more hostile. "Your daughter's toys are ruining the neighborhood's image," Karen said, her voice dripping with authority. "And you're going to move them. Now." Maria tried to explain that the toys weren't a problem, that Sarah needed them to play, but Karen cut her off, her voice rising with anger. "You have to take them inside. I won't tolerate this any longer." Maria, exhausted from the constant tension, did what she could to appease Karen. She offered to move the toys into the backyard, where they wouldn't be visible. But Karen wasn't satisfied. "It's not enough. You don't understand the damage your family is causing," Karen said, her voice low and dangerous. The words hung in the air like a ticking time bomb. Maria had a sickening feeling that this wouldn't be the end. She had no idea just how far Karen would go to get what she wanted. But Karen wasn't finished yet. Her obsession with Sarah and her toys had only just begun. And in the coming days, that obsession would lead to an act of violence that no one could have predicted. The situation had gone from bad to worse, but nothing could have prepared Maria for what was about to unfold. The increasing pressure from Karen, the relentless harassment, and the constant fear that Sarah's simple enjoyment of her own yard might be taken away, it had all been building to this boiling point. Maria couldn't believe that things had come to this, but it seemed like there was no way to avoid the inevitable. Karen was done asking. She was done compromising. Now, she was ready to take matters into her own hands, and no one, not even Sarah, would be spared. It was a warm afternoon when it all began to escalate. Maria was inside, tidying up the kitchen, when she heard the familiar sound of Karen's voice shouting from outside. At first, Maria thought it was just another complaint, another angry tirade about the toys on the lawn. But this time, the tone in Karen's voice was different. There was a sharpness, a vindictiveness that Maria had never heard before. It felt as though Karen's hatred had reached a dangerous new level. The shouts grew louder, and Maria rushed outside, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. She had seen Karen in her yard countless times before, but this was different. This time, Karen was standing at the edge of the yard, her hands clenched into fists, her face twisted with anger. "You're letting your daughter ruin everything," she screamed, her eyes narrowed with contempt. "I've had enough of your disregard for the rules. This is your last warning." Maria's heart raced, and she tried to step forward, her hands held up in a gesture of peace. "Karen, please," she pleaded. "She's just playing. It's her yard. You don't have to get so upset about a few toys." But Karen was beyond reason. "Your daughter doesn't belong here," she shouted, her words cutting deep. "She's a nuisance, and I'll make sure everyone knows it." Before Maria could respond, Karen took a step back, her gaze still fixed on Sarah. Sarah was sitting on the grass, completely oblivious to the confrontation unfolding in front of her. She was simply enjoying her toy truck, laughing as she pushed it back and forth, her face illuminated by the joy of a moment so simple, yet so precious. But Karen saw nothing but a problem. She was done talking, done waiting, and without a word, she turned and stormed back to her house, leaving Maria standing frozen in disbelief. But this wouldn't be the end of it. This was just the beginning. Later that evening, after Sarah had been put to bed, Maria and Robert discussed the events that had unfolded. They couldn't shake the feeling that things were getting out of hand. They had tried to be kind, tried to reason with Karen, but it had done nothing. Now, Maria feared that Karen was capable of anything. Her obsession with controlling their lives, with dictating how they should raise their child, had gone too far. But what could they do? The HOA was supposed to be there to protect them, to ensure that neighbors lived in peace. But in this case, it felt like the HOA was enabling Karen's tyrannical behavior. The community was silent, and no one was willing to stand up to Karen. The next day, as Sarah played outside again, the tension in the air was palpable. Maria watched from the window, her heart heavy with the sense of impending doom. She knew Karen wouldn't just let it go. She had already taken things too far, and Maria feared that her daughter's safety was at risk. But she never imagined that Karen would go to such extreme lengths to maintain control. It was in that moment that Maria saw Karen approaching again, her expression colder than ever. This time, there was no shouting, no demand to move the toys. Instead, Karen was carrying something in her hand. It was a large object, something shiny, and it was clear from the way Karen held it that it was no toy. Maria's heart skipped a beat. What was she planning to do this time? Karen didn't say a word as she approached, her eyes locked on Sarah, who was still playing peacefully. The tension was so thick that Maria could almost feel it in the air. She tried to run toward the yard to stop Karen, to ask her what she was doing, but it was too late. Before Maria could reach her daughter, Karen raised the object in her hand and pointed it at Sarah. For a moment, everything stood still. The world seemed to hold its breath, and in the next instant, the sound of a gunshot rang out, shattering the silence. Maria's world collapsed around her as she watched Sarah fall to the ground, a cry of pain escaping her lips. Her heart stopped as she rushed toward her daughter, the blood rushing in her ears, the world spinning as she tried to process what had just happened. Karen stood there, her face expressionless, as if she hadn't just committed an unthinkable crime. She didn't even flinch at the sound of the shot. Instead, she simply stood there, watching Sarah writhe in pain, her body limp and unmoving on the ground. For a split second, Maria couldn't move. Her body was frozen with shock, unable to comprehend what she had just witnessed. But the moment she saw Sarah's blood-stained shirt, the floodgates of terror opened. She screamed her daughter's name and rushed to her side, her hands trembling as she tried to stop the bleeding. Every second felt like an eternity as she frantically pressed her hands against the wound, praying that Sarah would be okay. Karen stood motionless, as if she had no care in the world. Her eyes didn't soften, and there was no regret in her expression. There was only the cruel satisfaction of a woman who had finally taken control in a way that left no room for argument. The shot had been fired, but this was only the beginning of the nightmare the Ramirez family was about to endure. What had once been a quiet neighborhood dispute was now something far more sinister, a tragedy that would change their lives forever. The moment the gunshot rang through the air, everything changed. The world seemed to freeze, and for Maria, time stood still. She was on the ground beside her daughter, shaking, her hands drenched in Sarah's blood, her heart hammering in her chest. The sight of Sarah's limp body, her small chest rising and falling with labored breaths, was too much to comprehend. Maria could hear Sarah's weak, raspy breathing, but everything around her seemed to blur into a fog of panic. "Sarah, please stay with me," Maria whispered desperately, her voice trembling. She didn't know how much time had passed, but it felt like a lifetime. Her hands pressed harder against the wound. But the blood kept flowing, a horrifying reminder of the damage that had been done. Behind her, Karen stood still, a cold, unblinking stare in her eyes. The gun was still in her hand, pointing downward now, but there was no remorse. No signs of guilt or fear. Just the chilling indifference of someone who had crossed a line they could never uncross. Maria's mind was racing, her thoughts jumbled, struggling to make sense of the chaos. Why would anyone do this? She wondered. Why would anyone shoot a child over a few toys in a yard? She could feel the anger rising in her chest, burning through the shock and terror. How could Karen, a woman who had been nothing but a neighbor, do something so monstrous? And yet here she was, standing, unflinching, watching Sarah suffer. Maria's hand gripped Sarah's, her voice shaking as she called for help. But as the minutes dragged on, Maria realized something. No one was coming. The neighborhood was silent, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding on their doorstep. Karen's power, her control over the HOA and the neighborhood, had insulated her from any real consequences. And now, it had enabled her to carry out an act of violence that no one could have predicted. "Why did you do this?" Maria cried out, her voice raw with grief. She wanted to understand, to make sense of the senseless. But Karen didn't respond. She just stood there, her eyes devoid of emotion, her grip still firm on the gun. The silence between them was suffocating. The police arrived what felt like an eternity later, but by then the damage had been done. They rushed Sarah to the hospital, and Maria followed, her mind consumed with fear and uncertainty. Was it too late? Would her daughter survive this? Or had Karen taken the one thing Maria had feared, losing more than anything, her precious daughter's life? Hours passed. The waiting room was a blur of faces, of hushed voices, and anxious glances. Maria couldn't stop replaying the moment in her mind. Sarah playing in the yard, the sound of the gunshot, the pain in Sarah's eyes as she collapsed to the ground. Maria had never felt so helpless in her entire life. She had always been there for Sarah, had always done her best to protect her, but this was beyond anything she could have ever prepared for. It wasn't just the injury that devastated Maria. It was the realization that Karen had been so far gone, so consumed by her need for control, that she was willing to take a life, an innocent child's life, to assert her dominance, to make an example of a family she deemed inferior. And to make it even more chilling, Karen had seemed to feel no remorse. She hadn't even flinched when Sarah had fallen to the ground. To her, it was just a means to an end, another way to get rid of the problem. And now, Maria was left wondering what kind of world they lived in, where a woman could take the law into her own hands, where a child could be shot over a few toys. What kind of person does that? Maria couldn't comprehend it, couldn't fathom that anyone could justify such an act. Yet there Karen stood, free, untouched by the law, while Sarah lay in a hospital bed, clinging to life. Hours later, when Maria was finally allowed to see Sarah, the sight of her daughter's bruised and battered body tore through her. The small incision on Sarah's chest, where the bullet had entered, was a painful reminder of the cruelty they had been subjected to. But despite the pain and the blood, Sarah was alive. She was breathing, and though she was unconscious, Maria could feel a flicker of hope. Her daughter was a fighter. She had always been a fighter, and Maria refused to give up on her. But as Maria sat by her daughter's side, holding her hand and watching over her, she knew that this wasn't just about physical healing. This was about something deeper, something darker. What would it take to bring justice? Could Karen be held accountable for her actions, or would she continue to get away with her cruelty? Maria wasn't sure. What she did know was this: the world they had once known was forever changed. They would never go back to the way things were. The nightmare had already begun, and it wasn't over yet. As the hours turned into days, Maria's thoughts shifted from the immediate concern of Sarah's recovery to the larger question of what had led to this violence. She couldn't let it go. She couldn't just let Karen walk away from this, not after what she had done. The police investigation was slow, but it eventually led to Karen being arrested. But even in custody, she remained eerily calm, unfazed by the gravity of her actions. The community, once quiet and complacent, was shaken. But would the law take the necessary steps to ensure that Karen would be held accountable for what she had done? Would the Ramirez family be able to find the justice they so desperately needed? As the trial date approached, Maria found herself consumed by one thought. This woman, who had stolen the peace and safety from their home, had to pay for her actions. But would the system stand up to someone like Karen? Would they finally see that this wasn't just an isolated incident, but the result of unchecked power, of a neighborhood that had allowed someone like Karen to take control and manipulate those around her for far too long? Maria wasn't sure. But one thing was certain: she wasn't going to stop fighting. Not until she had the justice her daughter deserved. Not until Karen had to face the consequences of her actions. The fight had just begun. The days following the shooting were filled with a haze of fear, confusion, and uncertainty. Sarah's survival was a miracle, but her recovery was far from certain. Each day that passed felt like a battle of its own. Maria and Robert sat by their daughter's hospital bed, holding her hand, praying for her to wake up, for the light of life to return to her eyes. But the physical pain was only a part of the trauma that weighed on them. What haunted Maria more than the sight of her daughter lying unconscious in a hospital bed was the looming question of whether justice would ever be served. Karen had been arrested, but even as she was taken into custody, there was an eerie calm about her. She showed no signs of remorse, no indication that she understood the gravity of her actions. To her, it was as if she had done nothing wrong, as if the life of a disabled child meant so little that a single shot could be justified. It sickened Maria to think that someone could be so devoid of empathy, so consumed by their own sense of power, that they could shoot a child without a second thought. The investigation into the shooting was thorough but slow. As the weeks dragged on, Maria's sense of helplessness grew. The legal system, which was supposed to protect her family, seemed to be moving at a glacial pace, and every delay only seemed to reinforce the idea that someone like Karen could get away with her crime. The thought that Karen might walk away unscathed was unbearable, but Maria knew she couldn't let it go. Sarah deserved justice. The media coverage of the case brought the HOA's practices into the public eye, exposing the toxic environment that Karen had cultivated in her pursuit of control. Neighbors who had once turned a blind eye to Karen's actions were now speaking out, recounting stories of how she had bullied and manipulated them. Maria had heard whispers of Karen's history of abuse, how she had used the HOA to impose her will on everyone around her, from demanding that people trim their trees to accusing families of violating rules that didn't even exist. But this was different. This wasn't just about broken rules. This was about the life of her daughter, a life that had been forever altered by one woman's obsession with control. The trial was a long, exhausting process. Karen's defense team painted a picture of her as someone who was merely enforcing the rules, a woman who had acted out of frustration over the Ramirez family's alleged disregard for the neighborhood's aesthetic. The prosecution, however, argued that Karen had crossed a line, that her actions were not those of a concerned neighbor, but of someone who had been driven by hate and a desire for power. The prosecutor emphasized the fact that Karen had taken a gun, a weapon meant for self-defense, and used it to commit an act of violence against a vulnerable child who had done nothing more than play in her own yard. Maria watched from the courtroom, her heart heavy with the weight of the legal battle. She had spent so many sleepless nights wondering if the justice system would fail them. Would Karen be held accountable for what she had done? Or would she be allowed to walk free, just as so many others had done before her, protected by her status as a respected member of the HOA? Every word, every motion in the courtroom felt like it carried the weight of her daughter's future. Maria sat there, focused on one thing: Sarah's chance at justice. As the trial wore on, more details emerged about Karen's past. The prosecution was relentless, bringing in witness after witness to testify to Karen's abusive behavior. It became clear that Karen had used her position in the HOA as a tool for manipulation and control, pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable, crossing ethical lines, and forcing neighbors to live in fear. But it was her attack on Sarah, her decision to take the life of an innocent child, that shocked everyone to their core. No amount of legal defense could excuse the calculated violence of her actions. When the jury went to deliberate, Maria could barely breathe. The weight of the last few weeks had drained her, and she felt a deep sense of exhaustion that went beyond the physical. She had already been through so much, and now it all came down to this. Would the law stand up to Karen's cruelty? Would Sarah's future be determined by this moment? It felt like an eternity before the verdict was announced. The courtroom was silent as the judge read aloud the jury's decision. Guilty. Karen was convicted of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. It was a victory, but it was bittersweet. The pain of Sarah's injury, the trauma that had been inflicted on their family, couldn't be undone. Justice had been served, but the cost was immeasurable. Sarah's recovery would be a long, difficult journey, and the emotional scars would take even longer to heal. The community, once divided by Karen's authoritarian rule, began to shift. People started to speak out, standing with the Ramirez family, acknowledging the harm that had been done. Some neighbors even apologized for turning a blind eye, for not intervening sooner. But Maria knew that the damage went deeper than just Karen. The HOA system, as it stood, had allowed her to thrive, had given her the power to destroy a family without facing any consequences. The conviction of Karen was a small but significant victory. It meant that someone had finally been held accountable for their actions. But it also signified a larger shift in the community's consciousness. No longer would people sit back and allow those in power to abuse their authority. The Ramirez family had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, they had sparked a change. Maria knew that the road ahead would be long, and the healing process would take time. But she also knew that she had to keep fighting for Sarah, for their family, and for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. The battle for justice was far from over, but it was a fight Maria was willing to continue for as long as it took. Because for Sarah, and for every other child who deserved to feel safe in their own home, it was a battle worth fighting. As the dust began to settle following Karen's conviction, Maria thought that perhaps, just perhaps, the worst was behind them. Sarah was slowly recovering, her body healing, but the emotional wounds, the ones that cut the deepest, would take far longer. Maria clung to the hope that with the trial over, they could finally begin to rebuild their lives and start anew. But it was in the quiet aftermath of the court's verdict that an unexpected revelation would change everything. Maria had always known that Karen's actions were motivated by more than just a warped sense of authority. The trial had made it clear that Karen was willing to go to any lengths to assert control, but there were still unanswered questions. What had truly driven Karen to take such extreme measures? Why had she singled out Sarah of all people? And why had no one in the neighborhood intervened sooner, knowing full well how Karen had treated others? The answers began to surface when an anonymous tip came in to the police. It wasn't much, just a few lines of information, scribbled hastily on a piece of paper, left in the mailbox of the Ramirez home. But those few lines would change the course of Maria's quest for understanding. The note revealed something startling. Karen's behavior, the bullying, the manipulation, and even the shooting of Sarah weren't just the result of her position in the HOA or her need for control. They were rooted in a much darker, more personal history. Karen had a deep-seated resentment toward disabled children, a prejudice that had been festering for years. The tip, though vague, suggested that Karen had lost a child to a disability in her past, a child she had failed to protect, a child she had loved but ultimately lost. The grief, the anger, and the guilt had consumed her, and now it seemed that Sarah and every other disabled child in her view had become a symbol of that loss. Maria felt a wave of shock and disbelief wash over her as the realization hit her. Karen hadn't just attacked Sarah out of a desire for control, she had targeted her because of her disability, because Sarah's very existence reminded Karen of the child she could never bring back. It was a bitter irony that had twisted Karen's mind and heart, turning her into someone who could justify harming another child, someone who saw no value in the life of a disabled person, someone who believed that Sarah's toys, her presence in the yard, were offensive reminders of her own guilt. The emotional weight of this revelation nearly broke Maria. The anger she had felt toward Karen, the desire for revenge, suddenly gave way to a strange mixture of sympathy and horror. Karen had, in some twisted way, been carrying around a pain that no one had known about. But it didn't excuse what she had done. It didn't change the fact that Karen had used her grief as an excuse to inflict suffering on an innocent child. Maria's thoughts turned inward. Could it be that she had failed to see this side of Karen? Could there have been a way to reach out to her, to help her heal from her past, instead of allowing her pain to manifest in such a destructive way? But then she remembered Sarah, her daughter, the child who had been shot for no reason other than her disability. The cruelty that had been inflicted on Sarah could never be justified, no matter the underlying cause. Maria's heart clenched with the understanding that no amount of sympathy or understanding could undo the harm Karen had caused. No amount of pain in Karen's past could ever make up for what she had done. But the revelation also sparked something new in Maria. If Karen's actions had been driven by a deep-seated pain, then perhaps there was something to be learned from this tragedy. Maria realized that it wasn't just about punishing Karen. It was about making sure this kind of hatred and ignorance never took root in their community again. It was about standing up for every disabled person, for every child who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong, like they didn't matter. It was about creating a future where no one would ever have to fear being targeted because of their differences. This moment of clarity shifted Maria's perspective. The fight for justice was no longer just about her family, or even just about Sarah. It was about something bigger, something more profound. It was about advocating for a society that valued inclusivity, compassion, and understanding rather than one that allowed hatred to fester and tear people apart. And while Karen's actions had caused irreparable harm, they had also illuminated the need for change, real change, in the way people treated each other, especially those who were most vulnerable. Maria knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but she also knew that she couldn't stay silent any longer. The emotional toll of what had happened to Sarah had been unbearable, but Maria had learned something invaluable through it all. The greatest strength lies not in seeking revenge, but in turning tragedy into purpose. Sarah had been the target of an unspeakable act, but she was also the catalyst for a movement that could change lives, a movement that would prevent this kind of thing from ever happening again. With this newfound sense of purpose, Maria threw herself into advocating for policies that would protect disabled individuals in their community. She worked with local lawmakers, spoke at town hall meetings, and became a voice for those who had been marginalized, ignored, and mistreated. The fight for justice didn't end with Karen's conviction. It was just the beginning of a larger, more meaningful battle. But it wasn't just about policy changes or legal reform. It was about changing the hearts and minds of people, encouraging them to see the world through the eyes of those who were different, to show compassion where there had been none before. It was about creating a world where people like Sarah could play outside without fear, where children could simply be children, free from prejudice and hate. As Maria looked at Sarah, who was now awake and recovering, a sense of pride began to replace the sorrow. Sarah was still her beautiful, vibrant daughter, and nothing, not Karen's actions nor the pain they had endured, could take away her spirit. In that moment, Maria knew one thing for certain. No matter what had happened in the past, no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And they would fight not just for their own peace, but for the peace of every child who deserved to live freely and safely in their own world. The months following the trial were a whirlwind of emotions for the Ramirez family. Sarah's recovery, while physically promising, was slow and fraught with setbacks. The scars left by the bullet, both on her body and in her spirit, were deep, but they were not the end of her story. Maria, Robert, and Sarah found solace in each other, in the strength they drew from their bond as a family. They knew they had been through something that no one should ever have to experience, but they also knew they had emerged from it stronger than ever. Maria's fight for justice, however, didn't end with Karen's conviction. While it was a victory in many ways, it was also a reminder that one woman's actions could have such a far-reaching impact. Karen had not only ruined Sarah's life, she had tarnished the fabric of their community. Maria was determined to make sure that Sarah's suffering wasn't in vain, that it would lead to real change, change that would ensure no other family would have to endure the kind of terror they had faced. In the months that followed, Maria became a prominent advocate for children with disabilities, using her platform to raise awareness about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of inclusivity. She spoke at local school events, met with lawmakers, and even worked with advocacy groups to push for stronger protections for disabled children and families in their community. Her message was clear. No one should ever feel like they are less than or that their lives don't matter simply because of who they are. But even as she fought for systemic change, Maria couldn't ignore the weight of what had happened to Sarah. The trauma of that day, the sound of the gunshot, Sarah's tiny body falling to the ground, the haunting image of Karen standing over them without an ounce of remorse, was something that would stay with Maria for the rest of her life. Every moment she spent fighting for others was also a moment she spent grieving for the daughter she had almost lost. But as time passed, Maria realized that part of her healing, part of Sarah's healing, was rooted in this fight for justice. It wasn't just about winning for Sarah, it was about winning for every child who had ever been made to feel small, to feel invisible. Every time Maria stood up and spoke out, she was ensuring that Sarah's story wouldn't be forgotten. It was no longer just about revenge, it was about creating a legacy of resilience, of courage, and of love. Slowly, the community began to shift. People who had once been silent, who had feared speaking out against Karen and her reign of control, now found their voices. Neighbors who had been too afraid to stand up for what was right were now coming together, demanding accountability from their HOA and local government. Maria's fight had ignited something, a spark that had long been smothered by fear and complacency. At the same time, the Ramirez family story began to capture the attention of the wider public. Local news outlets ran stories about the shocking events that had unfolded, bringing attention to the prevalence of bullying, abuse of power, and the mistreatment of disabled children in their community. Maria became an advocate for change, speaking at rallies, in interviews, and in forums about the urgent need for a more just and compassionate society. The more people heard her story, the more they realized that it was not just about Sarah, it was about every child, every family who had ever been mistreated, overlooked, or silenced. And as Maria's voice echoed louder, she saw change begin to take root. Several key pieces of legislation were passed in the months following Sarah's recovery, many of them directly inspired by the fight Maria had waged. New laws were introduced that aimed to protect disabled children and families from discrimination and violence, and the HOA system was overhauled to ensure that no one could abuse their power in the way Karen had. The changes weren't instantaneous, but they were tangible. They were the kind of changes that could prevent another child from ever having to face the same terror Sarah had endured. As for Sarah, her recovery was slow, but every day she grew stronger. The scar on her chest, though a permanent reminder of that fateful day, was no longer something that defined her. She was still the joyful, vibrant girl who had once played with her toys in the yard, and in many ways she was more determined than ever to live her life to the fullest. Maria and Robert watched with pride as their daughter regained her confidence, as she returned to the things she loved: drawing, reading, playing with her toys. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without struggle, but Sarah's spirit had not been broken. It was unshakable. In the end, the conviction of Karen was not just a legal victory, it was a moral one. It was a victory that sent a message to the community: no one, no matter how powerful or influential, is above the law. It was a victory that proved that a mother's love and determination could overcome even the darkest of times. And most importantly, it was a victory that showed that even in the face of unimaginable pain and loss, there was still hope. Hope that change could happen, that justice could be served, and that love could heal even the deepest wounds. As Maria stood at the podium at the final rally for disabled rights, surrounded by those who had supported her and Sarah throughout the journey, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. The road had been long, the battles many, but they had made it. Sarah was safe. Sarah was whole. And together, they had made sure that no one would ever have to face the kind of horror they had endured. Maria's heart swelled with pride as she watched Sarah stand beside her, her hand in hers. They had won, and in that moment it was clear to Maria that this fight had been worth every ounce of pain, every sleepless night, every tear. The victory wasn't just legal or political. It was a victory for love, for family, and for the resilience of the human spirit. Sarah's life, her future, was bright again. And nothing, not even Karen's cruelty, could ever take that away. As the months turned into years, the Ramirez family slowly rebuilt their lives, stronger and more united than ever. Sarah's wounds, both physical and emotional, began to heal, but Maria and Robert knew that the scars would always remain. There would always be reminders of that dark time: the sound of the gunshot, the cruel indifference of Karen, the fear and uncertainty that had taken over their lives. But they also knew that, despite everything, they had emerged from the darkness with a renewed sense of purpose and strength. Maria had poured herself into advocating for children like Sarah, those who were vulnerable and often overlooked, especially in a world that could be so cruel. She didn't want Sarah's suffering to be in vain. It wasn't just about the legal victory they had won or the laws that had changed. It was about creating a world where no child, no family ever had to face the same injustice they had. Her work as an advocate for disabled children took her across the country. She spoke at conferences, participated in interviews, and met with lawmakers, sharing Sarah's story to inspire others to take action. Maria had become a symbol of resilience, a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves, and a beacon of hope for families facing similar battles. She had been through the worst, but she had come out the other side stronger, more determined to make a difference. But Maria also knew that they had to keep pushing. While laws had been changed and policies had been altered, there was still so much work to be done. Karen's actions had shown them the ugly truth: how unchecked power, ignorance, and prejudice could destroy lives. And as much as they had fought for justice in their own case, Maria knew that it wasn't just about holding one person accountable, it was about changing the culture that allowed people like Karen to flourish in the first place. It was time for the world to stop turning a blind eye. It was time for people to stand up and say, enough is enough. It was time for every person, regardless of their background or ability, to feel seen, heard, and valued. The fight was far from over, but Maria was ready to continue it for Sarah and for every child who deserved to live in a world that recognized their worth. And so, Maria's call to action began. She used her platform to encourage others to get involved, to speak out against injustice, to fight for what was right. She urged parents, teachers, neighbors, and community leaders to stand up and advocate for the rights of those who couldn't always fight for themselves. She reminded everyone that real change doesn't happen through laws alone. It happens when communities come together to challenge the status quo, to demand better, to protect the vulnerable. The Ramirez family's journey had started with a moment of unimaginable violence, but it had ended in something far more powerful: transformation. The personal pain they had endured had become a catalyst for systemic change. Their voices, once silenced by fear and oppression, had become a rallying cry for others. And as the Ramirez family stood together at the final rally for disabled rights, their strength was evident in every word Maria spoke. "We are not victims of this story," Maria said, her voice steady and strong. "We are survivors. We are warriors. And we are here to ensure that no one else ever has to face the same kind of suffering we endured." The fight for justice is not just about one person. It's about all of us together, united, fighting for what is right. The crowd erupted in applause, and Maria felt a sense of pride swell in her chest. Sarah stood beside her, her hand tightly grasped in her mother's. Her face lit up with a smile that shone through the darkness of their past. Sarah was not just a survivor of violence. She was a symbol of strength, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As the rally came to a close, Maria addressed the crowd one last time, her voice filled with determination. "This fight does not end here. It does not end with me or with Sarah. It continues with each and every one of you who is willing to stand up for what's right. Together, we can make sure that the world is a place where every child, every person, is treated with dignity and respect. Together, we can ensure that no one ever has to live in fear again. Together, we can create a world that is truly inclusive, compassionate, and just." The applause grew louder, and Maria felt her heart swell with hope for the future. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but for the first time in a long while, Maria felt confident that the world was ready for change. She had seen firsthand how powerful one voice could be, and now she knew that together with the support of others, they could make a difference. And so, the Ramirez family's fight continued. It wasn't just a fight for their own peace, but for the peace of every family, every child, every person who had ever felt marginalized or oppressed. The journey was not over, but they had come a long way. The past would always be with them, but they would no longer be defined by the tragedy they had endured. Instead, they would be defined by their strength, their courage, and their unwavering belief that a better world was possible. As they walked off the stage, hand in hand, Maria looked down at Sarah, her heart full of love and gratitude. They had survived the worst, and together they would continue to fight for the future, a future where everyone had the chance to thrive, to be heard, and to be valued. This was just the beginning, and they were ready for whatever came next.